So thank you for the kind introduction. And today we're going to present to you architecturally leaking data from the microarchitecture.
Actually, we lied to you, since that's not the title. Today we are going to present an APIC leak, architectural leaking uninitialized data from the microarchitecture. You will witness the first architectural bug that is able to leak stale data without any side channel.
And furthermore, it's not a transient execution attack.
It's able to deterministically leak stale data from SGX enclaves.
And also, we do not even require hyperthreading for the basic leakage to happen.
Yeah, and it affects like most recent Intel CPUs.
So the name is APIC leak. So what is APIC leak? So in the name, we have APIC, and the component. So what is actually the APIC component in a modern CPU?
Yeah, so the APIC is this component in the CPU that is responsible to generate, receive, and manage all the interrupts for modern CPUs. We have a local APIC for every core and an I/O APIC for external devices. You interact with the APIC with the APIC registers that by default are memory mapped. They are mapped on a region that is a physical memory that is controlled by an MSR, and they are all 32 bits and always aligned to 16 bytes.
So wait, if it only have 32 bits and they always align to 16 bytes, we have a lot of free spaces in actually the APIC range.
Yes, and the really important thing is that you should never, ever access bytes 4 through 15 of this APIC MMIO region.
But why?
Oh, yeah, actually Intel tells it.
Oh.
If you read the APIC the Intel manual, you can see that any access to byte 4 through 15 may cause undefined behavior.
So wait, the Intel manual says that if you access those bytes, you get undefined behavior?
Yes.
Or incorrect results?
Exactly.
So let's try this.
Yes. So we can simply use a simple POC where we map the APIC and dump it.
Well, not so fast. So let me explain those lines. Let's go over the lines a little bit more slowly.
Yeah.
So in the first line, we can see that we map the physical address where the APIC is located into the virtual address space. So we can actually read from it. And then I assume this first dump APIC base from 0, that's just reading the normal.
Yeah, that's a valid register, so you're what you were expecting.
So we get 0 back.
But then let's continue. Let's continue mapping, dumping the APIC. So we see something.
So what's happening there? So if we access those bytes, these 4 to 15 bytes, we get back one interrupt?
Yeah, what is this? Is it in the APIC? If we continue to dump it, we have data. Isn't it strange?
So if you look at this memory dump we basically generated by just reading from the APIC, we can see that in the first 4 bytes, we always get valid APIC data. But on the bytes from 4 to 15, we get strings.
Yeah, that's strings. And what's happening here? We are architecturally leaking stale values just by dumping the APIC MMIO region.
So I can see that this is data, because that's obviously strings, one interrupt, source banding, or something like that. But if you take a look at this dump here, UUH, that's not a string. So
yeah,
what's that?
OK, that's not data. That's instructions.
Wait, these are instructions?
Yeah, let's disassemble it. You just see valid instruction. They're obviously not in the APIC, but we read that.
So we just recovered instructions which are able to disassemble from reading undefined APIC registers?
Exactly. OK, actually, not on every CPUs. So on most CPUs, you read either zeros or Fs, or sometimes even the whole CPU hangs, or triple faults and reboots. But on modern CPUs from Intel, 10, 11, and 12th generation CPUs, that's not the case.
OK. I see that we leak some data. I see that we leak some instructions. But where the hell do we leak instructions from? Where does the leakage actually come from?
Yeah. So we can devise simple experiments to try to understand, OK, where this data came from. We can we have here a model of the CPU with all the stages from the CPU to memory. And we can start to try to understand where does it come from.
OK, let's just systematically go over this. So can we leak, is the data leaking from the registers or the execution engine?
Yeah, so let's do an experiment where we only keep data in the registers, or we make simple operation with that, and we don't see that data. So it's not coming from register or the execution engine.
What about the private caches of the core, so L1 or L2?
Yeah, so like now we were talking about memory. And OK, if we like, access a lot of memory, we see leaks. But if we only access a small amount of memory, like that fits in the L1 or L2 cache, we don't see anything.
OK, I also see that. What about the shared cache, so the LSC, or even the RAM, or the memory subsystem in general?
Yeah, that's interesting, too. If we access like a lot of memory from a core, then we see leaks. But if we only access that memory from another core different than the one that we are leaking from, we don't see any leak there.
OK, so we systematically go over all these components. What is missing? What did we miss?
Yeah, it must be something in the middle, and that's the superqueue.
So what's the superqueue?
So it's really simple. The superqueue is this decoupling buffer between the L2 cache and the LLC. It just contains like all the data that passes between the two caches, like from the L2 to the LLC and back and forth. So if you were like, if you know like MDS attacks and all this stuff that were targeting like line-fill buffers, it's the same, but line-fill buffers were between L1 and L2 cache, and here we're talking about L2 cache and LLC cache.
OK, so but we're now talking about an interconnection between the L2 and the LSC. And we can leak data that's passing over this interconnection. But can we actually leak all the data that's passing over these interconnections?
No. OK, first of all, we are talking about undefined offsets of the APIC MMIO. So every time we read like the initial values of the APIC MMIO registers, we don't see anything. So we only leak 3/4 of a cache line.
Oh, I can see that, because 1/4 of each of the 16-byte regions is actually a valid APIC register. So you will never leak from that, because you're giving just back the defined APIC value for the register.
Yeah, and then there is something more. We cannot explain this, but in all our experiments, we always ever observed even cache lines. So if we map if you number the cache lines in a page from like the 0th, the first, the second, etc., you only leak values from the 0th, the second, the first, and that's it. So we can leak like 3/4 of even cache lines. And now we see we have these really cool attacks where we leak data from the superqueue. And so we can think about it as if it was like an initialized memory read, but in the CPU itself. So it's not like at the software level, but that's at the hardware level. But we have kind of, like, I would say, a problem here. To exploit this, we have to access the APIC MMIO registers. And the problem is that only like something like an operating system can access that. So, I mean, what can we attack with this?
So actually, there, Intel SGX comes to the rescue. And yeah.
Interesting. What's Intel SGX?
So Intel SGX is this environment, also the software guard extension that aims to give you an environment where your code and data is all protected against a privileged attacker. And this also includes a malicious operating system, for example.
So with a malicious operating system, we could like map the APIC MMIO region and access it to leak data. That's
exactly
interesting. But how do you protect memory with SGX?
So one of the key concepts of SGX is that it transparently encrypts data that is stored in the enclave. This is done by the enclave page cache. This is a small region in RAM where basically the data gets transparently encrypted if you write data to it.
OK, that's interesting. So we are talking about pages, but isn't the like operating system that manages pages here?
Yes, that's a really good point. Also in SGX, the operating system is still responsible for the page management of an enclave. And furthermore, in each of the enclaves in SGX, you have one special page, the so-called state safe area. And the idea of this page is to store register values. You have to safely store them. For example, if an asynchronous event occurs, think of like an interrupt. The idea is that you store the registers there before giving back the control flow to the operating system, which is potentially malicious.
Oh, that's cool. So if we target SGX enclaves, we can like sample data from this enclave. Like we can run the enclave and use an hyperthread to like dump the APIC, and then dump the APIC and leak the values that they are using. But that's not enough. Like, how can we leak interesting data? Is there any way that we can like force the data that we want to leak to be in the superqueue and like to keep this data long enough to be able to leak those data?
That's a really good point, and that brings us to enclave shaking. So enclave shaking uses those two instructions which are basically responsible for taking a page out of the EPC page cache and bringing them back to main memory. This is done so by using the EVB instruction, and this brings the data from the encrypted page to the core, re-encrypts it, and then stores it into the main memory. And if you can guess what the counterpart is?
Yeah, I would say that the LDO instructions then brings the page from the main memory and decrypts it and put it back into the APC.
Exactly. And this gets a bit more visualized here. If you see on the right side, we have one page inside the SGX page cache, and we can now use EWB to bring that page to the core, re-encrypt it, and then put it out into the main memory.
Okay, this is very interesting, since while we bring this page back and forth to the CPU, to the memory, then we are literally making the page pass through the super queue, so that we will have the data that is in the page passing through our super queue, that we can leak that.
Exactly. And the same happens if you take the reverse route, the inverse route from an encrypted page in main memory, in this case it's P2. We bring it to the core, we decrypt it, and can put it back into the EPC page cache with the LDO instruction.
And this passes as well through the super queue,
yes,
so that we can target it and leak it. But OK, that's not enough. I want a cool attack. We can only control whole pages here. I want to precisely target cache lines, so that we can, for example, select what we want to leak with this attack.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. And we also have a solution for that. It's called cache line freezing. And as we mentioned in the beginning, this threat model is already strong enough that we can simply sample data from the super queue. But we can also use the hyperthread. We don't need it, but if we use the hyperthread, we can enhance the leakage even further. Why is that? Think about it. The hyperthread and its sibling share the super queue.
Oh, that's cool. So this means that another thread can affect what is kept in the super queue with just using memory.
Yes, and we also use a theory basically that 32 bytes of zeros are never actually transmitted over the zero queue.
OK, this is cool. How does it work?
Yeah, so let's take a look at that. So in this animation we have on the top left, we have two threads. Thread 1 has an address where it tries to access a secret value from the memory. Thread 2 also has an address, a different address, but the page offset of that address is the same. And if thread 1 now tries to read from that address, the secret is loaded into the super queue, then forwarded to the private caches, and finally it ends up in the read.
That's cool. So we have the secret in the super queue now, so that we can leak it.
Yes, that's basically without using hyperthreading.
Okay.
But what happens now if thread 2, at the same time or after the first secret access was performed, accesses the different address where the access are located? So the access are then replacing that super queue entry, again brought back into the L1, L2 caches, and forwarded to the different read.
Wait, now we don't have any more the secret in the super queue. We just destroyed what we wanted to leak.
Yes, we overrode our secret. So if we now use APIC, we get back the access. So we didn't gain much there. However, if we now take a look at the zero case, and we perform the secret access again in thread 1, the data travels over the super queue into the private caches to the read. And now thread 2 accesses that address where the zeros are located. Something different happens. Zeros our theory says that the zeros are marked differently in the super queue and are actually never transmitted. So we just mark the super queue entry that it contains now all zeros. This is then resolved and forwarded to the private caches and ends up in the final read.
So this is like an optimization to avoid passing zeros through the cache hierarchy?
We actually don't know, but yeah,
that's
likely.
Interesting.
So if we take a look now, we can see that we have frozen the secret inside the super queue entry. And what we can now do is we can use APIC, the undefined bytes, the undefined aligned bytes, to read that secret out of the super queue entry.
OK, this is cool. And I guess this is APIC leak.
Yes.
So APIC leak just combines all these techniques. We can use enclave checking to make pages of targets SGX enclaves pass through the super queue and then freezing those cache lines that we want to leak using cache line freezing so that we can precisely target what we want to leak. Basically, with APIC leak, we can leak 3/4 of every single cache line that is at an even offset. And we can do this from any SGX enclave page that we want to target.
And one of the biggest and strongest parts is that we can do that even without the enclave running, because the encrypted pages exist still after an enclave is idling. So we can attack an enclave even though the enclave is not running.
OK, this is cool, but what can we do with this?
So this brings us to our two attack setups we have in the publication there. And the first one is just targeting data and code. So we've seen that we can leak data and code where you're reading the APIC registers, and the idea is now quite simple. We start an enclave and wait until the enclave is filled with some secret data.
Oh, OK, so then we just move the page that we want to target out of the APC. OK, this is cool.
And if you remember in the beginning where we talked about SJX, there was this one special page. And this page is the solution how we can leak register contents. So the idea there is there a bit different. So we start at the enclave again, but then we wait to a specific instruction and force the enclave to store the content of its registers onto that special page.
Oh, so it's the same then. We move the SSA page out, freeze the cache line that we want to leak, and by selecting the cache line, we can then select the register that we want to leak, and then like dump the APIC MMIO, dump the stuff that we want to leak, and then move it back.
Exactly. And as you remember, there are blind spots. So there's actually a few spots where we can't leak data from. And this also maps to registers where we can't leak from. So we have some general purpose registers where we only leak partial content, but also some registers we can't leak completely.
OK, that's interesting. Wait, what is happening?
You know what it is? It's demo time.
Oh, that's cool. Were you leaking these lights from an enclave?
Yes. So let's try this. So I'm trying something risky here. I'm SSH connected to a system in our home country, and I have here a few things in that folder. So we can see here that there is an AES enclave. So this AES enclave uses the ASNI instruction set to perform AES encryptions.
That's interesting. So ASNI is a special instruction set for like x86 CPUs, where the AES encryption and encryption steps are implemented in hardware. And this is really like resistant to like all different attacks, like side channels or like also like different.
Yes, and one specific instruction in the ASNI instruction set is the ASN key gen assist. So this instruction is used in order to generate the round keys from the root key. So if you now take a look at that enclave and simply disassemble it and search for that instruction, which is called VAS key gen assist, we will find it at some point inside the enclave. And for our attack to work, we now know that at this point inside the code execution of the enclave, in the register XMM0 will be the key for that encryption.
So if we stop the enclave at that moment, then the SSA page at the offset where XMM0 register is stored, it will contain the private key that we want to leak.
Yes. So in order to perform our attack, we need two components. First, we need to locate the page offset at which this instruction is located. So in our case, it's the page 20 inside the enclave. And we also need to know at which instruction we have to stop. So basically, the nth instruction on that page. I don't show you this. It's the 13th instruction on that page, because there's stuff in the beginning. And now we simply edit a config. So we create a config file, and we add there that we want to target this 20th page in the SJX enclave. We want to target the 13th instruction onside the page, and we want to leak XMM0.
So now we can like wrap the enclave and stop it precisely at the point where we want to leak the data.
So, and if we now execute our attack program, yes, I want to paste sudo, we can see that we directly recovered the ASNI key of that encryption. And
you see how fast was that? This is like showing that this is not like a transient-execution attack where you have to employ a side channel and leak the stuff that is like noisy and slow. This is architectural leak. So you dump it, and that's it.
And if you now take a look at, if we dump the key out of the actual source code of the enclave, we can see that the key parts from the byte 4 to 15 actually match the ASNI key used in this example. And you might be wondering now, so we can see that the XMM0 register has this blind spot. However, if you think about it, this is just one position in the code where we leaked already 3/4 of the secret key. The key travels through a lot more code in order to be at that position. So we can combine multiple leakage sources in order to recover the remaining 4 parts, as we did in the publication at some point. So that brings us back to the presentation, and I can skip the backup videos. So
I'm amazed it worked for the first time.
Yes, I'm also amazed. So let's talk about mitigations. So we have seen that we can precisely target and leak secret information stored in registers. We can dump enclave pages, but how can we protect against that?
Yes, this is a really powerful attack that needs to be mitigated. And Intel released mitigations for that, obviously. And OK, the first thing is to recommend to disable the APIC MMIO region. this is like closing literally the attack surface for that. If we like look at it in like with respect to like an hypervisor that may map the APIC MMIO region, but obviously this is not enough. So in practice, this mitigation will enable X2 APIC. That's like a newer version for APIC, and this is also faster. So it's like highly recommended. But this is not enough for like SGX enclaves, where like a malicious operating system can just like not disable APIC MMIO and just like bypass this mitigation. So Intel also released microcode patches, and these patches flash the super queue on like all the SGX transitions, so that you can, if you like try to move the page in and out, then you will not have the data in the super queue that you want to leak.
Yeah, and as always, one suggested mitigation, or the general rule of thumb basically is if you use SGX, you should also disable hyperthreading. Why? Because if you now consider these super queue flushes, and we only flush during entry and exit of this SGX enclave, the hyperthread can still be running in between those transitions and leak data over the super queue.
Yes, exactly. So for who is interested, this is the timeline. We discovered this attack in December, and like it was embargoed until yesterday when it went public.
So that brings us to the conclusion. So we have seen that by reading unaligned memory from the APIC, we can actually leak data and code. We have seen some techniques how we can extend those leakage to precisely target cache lines inside an enclave to dump registers and even data pages. So overall, we say that APIC leak is the first architectural leak that is capable of leaking stale data from the super queue.
It does not require hyperthreading, even if we can exploit hyperthreading to improve our attack, and it affects like most recent Intel CPUs. If you want to learn more about the attack, you can go to epicleak.com or even read our paper that will be published by Usenix in 2 days.
Yes. So thank you for your attention.